Good day, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very, very warm welcome to all of you on this interesting and fascinating session in the Daring Cities 2020 program. We're going to talk about resilience planning and disaster risk reduction for the unexpected. So we're actually, the COVID-19 pandemic has actually illustrated that we are not ready for the unexpected. We have an exciting lineup, and I will just close my camera quickly that you can also take a look at the screen. I hope you can see my screen. And we've got a wonderful lineup today with a keynote speaker, Steve Gawler, who will be introducing the ICLEI methodology and ICLEI approach as a sort of a sneak preview, which we will be launching our resilient development methodology later during Daring Cities. And we're very, very pleased to have Commissioner Bridget Shea with us. She's the Commissioner for Precinct 2 in Travis County in the US. So very warm welcome to you, Bridget. Unfortunately, the Mayor of Kampala was not able to join us today, but we'll have a colleague from ICLEI Africa standing in to explore and explain a little bit what's happening in Kampala and other cities across Africa. And last but not least, very, very pleased to have Eva Streberova, the project manager of the city of Bratislava, with us, a real expert, and her colleague Ingrid unfortunately had to share her apologies, but Eva will be standing in for the city of Bratislava. So we have nice examples from 3 continents, and actually would be having hopefully very interesting discussions towards the end of the session. So this would be brief keynote speech, then followed by a panel, and then we'll open the floor. If you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to type in questions in the chat box, and we'll take note of the questions and have a wonderful conversation towards the end of the session. So, as we know, the thematic topic of resilience and disaster risk reduction in this current context of COVID-19 has shown that we're not very resilient in our cities, and that we tend to act more sort of on a case-by-case crisis, if you will. And we're not necessarily also very effective at the moment yet with post-disaster recovery, reconstruction, where we need to really think about cities redesign, making things more resilient, using the crisis and anticipating crises, not thinking of the typical traditional single hazard focus, but really trying to understand and explore the connections between multiple and cascading hazards. So Steve will be setting the scene for us. And Steve, if you'd like to load and share your screen.
Fantastic. Okay. Look, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. And I'd like to acknowledge the fact that we've got people from just about every zone of the world. So I think that's really impressive, including some people from my area, Australia, New Zealand, where it's really quite early on the Saturday morning. Okay, what is the ICLEI approach to building greater urban resilience? Firstly, the way I've been using the term resilience in what I'm going to talk about today is that all cities have their long-term development plans. Of course, they're to build greater sustainability, and they're very much aligned with sustainable development goals. That's the main game. And how do we make sure we stay on course to achieve those sustainable development goals and ambitions when cities are always being buffeted by shocks and stresses? So resilience is actually your ability to stay on course. Regardless of shocks and stresses that occur, you can still continue to really push towards your goals. That's a simple definition of resilience, which we're using. And ICLEI has been developing over the last 2 or 3 years a guide or a step-by-step planning process which cities can follow to build greater urban resilience. It's based on some work we've been doing for, I guess, 8 or 10 years now around climate change, where ICLEI has developed a fairly generic step-by-step approach that cities can follow to plan for climate change, take action, and then review and accelerate their action. We've used this for integrated climate planning, and so that's working on how to reduce our emissions, move to clean energy, and adapt to climate risk. We've used it more recently for our nature-based program, the Cities with Nature. So the graphic on the front of this slide is actually the Cities with Nature graphic. And we've now adapted that to look at all forms of resilience and resilience challenges in cities. So the graphic sitting in behind there is this new urban resilience planning cycle, which we're being a little bit coy about so far because it has not been officially launched. So that's why it's sort of hiding in behind the main graphic. This is to help cities be prepared for basically anything. So it is for the unexpected. That's the big challenge in this sort of work. If we know we're talking about climate change, you can focus quickly, you can get the right people in the room, you can start collecting the data. But if we don't know what it is we're preparing for, then it's a much more challenging task. So this is quite different from a lot of the planning tools that you will typically see and use. It needs to be generic. It needs to cater for almost anything, any events, any catastrophe which could befall your city. And so it needs to be very broad and not specific to a certain type of threat. However, because we're all grappling with the pandemic, we're right in the middle of it. We're trying to work out, firstly, how to get out of the pandemic, and secondly, what we can do in future years to be better prepared than we were this time. This first edition of the Urban Resilience Planning Cycle actually has a very strong pandemic content to it. So we're calling it the COVID edition of this ICLEI planning cycle. How to use this? It's actually written as a step-by-step guide. There's actually quite a long document that backs it up, which potentially city practitioners could use, and it would guide them to take every step. However, many cities have already done quite a lot of the pieces which make up this planning cycle, and so you would probably choose to focus on some of the steps where you need to do more work. So we think probably one of the most effective ways of using this planning cycle is as a check, almost as an audit tool or a diagnostic. We think we've done a lot of work preparing for the various risks. Have we done enough? Have we covered enough risks? We can use this as a way to work our way through the studies and the risk management plans we already have and see where we need to do more work. It's also designed to be used by almost any city. It's not a methodology which only works for very large, high-capacity cities. It's written deliberately so that it could be used by almost any city in any part of the world. Because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to now focus on three of the most interesting steps. And an early step, of course, has to be to scan all the possible threats, all the possible hazards that might strike your city, and then to start deciding which ones you need to be prepared for. Typically, when you do this sort of work, you almost assume, well, we'll need to be prepared for climate change and we'll need to be prepared for earthquakes, etc. And we tend to go in with some predetermined thinking. So it's very important that we can scan all sorts of mishaps which could befall our city. And so it's useful to use a menu or a bit of a shopping list. And this slide gives you an example of a menu put together by the World Bank and DRR. And it rather arbitrarily divides up threats and hazards as natural, as technological, as socio-economic. We were putting this together 2 or 3 years ago, so it's interesting to look down the left-hand column and we can see that epidemic, pandemic was already listed. And so hopefully some cities were already planning for epidemics, pandemics. The city of Melbourne, where I live, I believe they did their first epidemic plan in 2008. And I know the Australian government in 2008 also not only did a plan, but they set up quite an impressive wargaming to test their readiness. But there are some very interesting other forms of hazards here. The bottom of the second column is very interesting, where major systems breakdowns, water, energy, if the ICT systems go down across an entire city, are we prepared? And the bottom of the socio-economic column as well, some of the critical pipelines to cities, the food supply, the water supply, energy supply, etc. Are we prepared if there are major disruptions for those? So an early step needs to be to do that scan and come up with a short list of the threats or the hazards which we think are most likely in our city. The next step is to then say, okay, let's look at our own city operations. Let's look at the nature of our city. What are our strengths and what are our most fragile points? What are the most critical city systems? And every city has its weaknesses, whether it's air pollution or the traffic congestion or poor water supply or whatever. So we already know where our weaknesses are. And it's very useful to apply the previous set of hazards which we've identified to what we think are the most critical systems in our city. Again, there's quite a lot of guidance in the methodology about what sort of systems you can consider. This is just an example. Some of the core systems which cities need to survive, food, shelter, transport, etc. Some of the secondary systems, health, education, markets, sanitation, etc. And by putting together the hazards with our critical city systems, we start to get a picture of where we need to focus our attention. So then comes the assessment, the analysis. And this step has been taken very strongly from the climate change field, where we first use a risk assessment to start to prioritise what we think are our greatest threats. And then we proceed to look at the vulnerabilities. I won't say much about the risk assessments because that's fairly well known, but it's basically taking each of the threats on our list, talking about how likely they are to occur or how frequently, and if they do occur, what the impacts are likely to be on our city. And that's where the city systems analysis is very useful. So if we take the pandemic, the likelihood we've always thought was fairly low. We all tell ourselves this is a 1 in 100 year event. What are the consequences? Which systems are likely to be most affected? And we're all learning a lot right now about the cascading influence of risks and threats on systems. The fact that it might start off looking like being a health problem, but then it becomes an economic problem, and then it becomes a social problem. So we need to always be looking for cascading events, how one event can lead to other problems. There are some really interesting examples that I've observed. In Australia recently, you'd be aware we had very catastrophic wildfires, particularly in the east and the southeast of Australia. This followed drought. So that area was already devastated by drought, which meant that businesses and farms were in a very weak economic position and the vegetation was tinder dry. So when that was followed by very high temperatures and lightning strikes, the fires were far more damaging than they might have been in other years. Drought had cascaded to very damaging fires. One of the interesting impacts of that was the water supply on some of the towns became so heavily polluted by the ash from the catchments, because there was no grass on the catchments, that the water supply systems in the cities was no longer drinkable. And towns and cities in Australia typically don't have good supplies of bottled water because that's not what we normally need. So that's the sort of cascading impacts that we need to look for. Having identified what are the highest risks we need to deal with, we've then used the climate change approach to assessing vulnerability. So firstly, what is the exposure to that particular threat? Secondly, what's our sensitivity to that? Are we fairly resilient already and a certain amount of pressure on a particular system won't make it break? But if it does break, who's it going to hurt most and where is it going to hit most? And one thing you can do is develop a hotspot map, such as the one on the slide here, which overlays the threats and the vulnerabilities and helps the city government to see where they need to focus their greatest attention. So those are just some of the steps. The planning cycle has all of the other steps of how we turn our vulnerability assessment and hotspot mapping into actions, how we assess our action plan, take action, etc. But this is all probably we've got time to look at in this session. So I wanted to finish by looking at some of the important principles which underpin the methodology. But I think these are the principles also which we're all grappling with right now as we deal with the academic. Firstly, the need for redundancy in our systems, ideally to have distributed systems, not overly centralised, and to have backups. So if our city is reliant on an energy supply which comes from only one source, then we're very vulnerable. We're not resilient. If we only have one hospital and the hospital is in a vulnerable location in the city, then that's very vulnerable. There's no resilience in that system. If we have great surge capacity in our health facilities to deal with the likes of pandemics, then building in surge capacity gives us greatest resilience. Second, the importance of nature, of bringing back nature, of boosting nature in our cities, because nature gives us natural buffers against many of the pressures that we're talking about. It improves our air supply, it improves our water supply, it improves our physical and mental health. One of the biggest learnings and one of the biggest principles in resilience is under any stress or shock, the vulnerable are the first to be hit and the vulnerable become even more vulnerable. And haven't we seen that with the pandemic? So to build resilience during peace times, during quiet times, we need to be developing very strong social protection systems around income support, around food, around housing, around health, etc. And finally, for greatest resilience in our cities, communication, communication, communication. We've seen too many examples in the pandemic of governments putting out scrambled messages. We've seen that in the last week with a certain Prime Minister putting out messages and then having to recant and correct the messages. We see that at the local level, where the local outlets for communication haven't got the information they need. People are hungry for information during a stress time. We have to be better at that. We have to have backup facilities in our communication systems and not just be relying on one channel. And these days we have to be very aware of the infodemic. Wrong rumours, deliberately false news being circulated by the social media. We have to be able to combat that. So to finish, I think we all understand a green, socially just recovery from COVID will build a sound basis for dealing with future stresses and shocks. Our resilience planning has to be based on green, socially just principles. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that was a useful start.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. This is very interesting, and indeed, it's a sad reality that we do have the COVID-19 as a test case to explore also in practice what this means. Without much ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Bridget Shea to share with us what's going on in Texas, in Travis County, specifically looking at practical local experiences. How you've dealt with those would be very interesting. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and I just have to say I echo the last comment from, is it Steve? I see him as Marika, but I think it's Steve, our first presenter, about the infodemic. We certainly are suffering from that in the United States, and I hope we're able to remedy it with the election. At any rate, the context that you provided for having a methodical process for evaluating climate threats and figuring out actions is very useful. And I think actually we followed it without knowing it on our experiment here in Travis County, which is essentially the city of Austin, Texas, in the middle of Texas. I actually ran for office because I was very concerned that we weren't doing enough to prepare people to try and get out of harm's way from climate change. And so when I took office first in 2015, we just began asking the question, what can the county do? What kinds of tools or resources could the county help create to help our citizens? And so we came up with this experiment that I'm going to walk you through, but that was kind of the context for it. So my first slide, obviously we all know the planet's getting hotter, and that cascading effect is exactly what we're seeing happening in Travis County, Austin, Texas. We are getting much hotter, we're getting much drier, And we are now one of the top urban wildfire threat regions in the entire United States because of that combination of cascading effects. And so we began with this question: how can we better prepare our residents to get out of harm's way? Because the reality is, and this is another one of those aspects of a threat assessment, there are not enough first responders to rescue everyone. And I am certain that's true across the entire planet. Most people, probably in the first world, believe that if there's an emergency, they can call for help and someone will respond, ambulance or firefighter or law enforcement. But if you just do the math, there are not enough of those first responders to rescue everyone. And so the reality there is we need to have training and programs and tools for our residents to get themselves out of harm's way. To me, that's a really important part of the analysis, and I don't think in most places that our residents have that mindset or are preparing in that way. Another point is, in the US, I can't speak to the operating procedures in other countries, but in the US, our emergency staff are very good at crisis response. They have an almost military style command and control, and they work in a command center, and they have control over what they do to respond. But it's the 99% of the rest of the population that doesn't know what to do. And so that's where we focused on the community preparedness, apart from what the first responders practice and are very good at doing. They're skilled at that. It's just the rest of us who don't know what to do. So we started with this premise that if fire drills are good for school children, then they should also be good for our neighborhoods. And so we set out to test that premise. But just a little bit of background first on it. Back to my point about how we're one of the highest urban wildfire threat regions in the country. Most people in our region didn't know that. And so we got a wake-up call. In 2011, a city to the east of Austin literally burned to the ground. It was the most destructive wildfire in our history. 1,700 homes, 40 commercial buildings destroyed at a cost of $325 million. 2 people also died. We were thankful that there weren't more. But this was shocking to people in Austin. This is an actual picture from Austin looking east toward the community that was on fire. And I think people just didn't realize that it could happen here. And it was frightening. And I think it was hopefully a wake-up call that it can happen here and we're not safe because we're in a city. That same day, it was this combination of cascading effects. It was extremely hot, very dry, and windy. And so there were fires that erupted all around the city of Austin. The first one I showed you was to the east. This photo is to the west, a subdivision that had about 10,000 people in it. And most people maybe were aware that there was only one way in and out, but when they all had to evacuate, everyone realized how unworkable that infrastructure design was. We've since improved our planning and we're not allowing any new subdivisions with less than 2 ways in and out. But in this instance, people were stuck in traffic for hours, and had the wind not shifted away from them, many of them might have burned to death in their cars. The other thing that became very apparent to people was the command and control operating process of our first responders did not allow them to go back to their homes to retrieve their children or their elderly parents or disabled family members or pets. And that is one of the problems that we tried to address. This image gives you a sense of it, but this mechanism of blockading the entrance is repeated every time the first responders have to evacuate an area. They literally set up a blockade. Part of it is to keep out potential looters, but the other is to prevent people from going back in because they're trying to evacuate, so they don't want people going back in. And in the case of the subdivision that I showed you the picture of, people were driving up, telling the law enforcement at the blockade, my child is stuck at home, my elderly parent, my pet, whatever, and they were told, I'm sorry, you can't come in. And I talked to the first responders. They said they watched people turn their car around, park on the side of the road, and run in. And this is a subdivision that's miles, the entrance and the road in is miles long, so that wasn't very practical, but that is a reality with their current methodology for evacuating in case of a fire or some other disaster. So what that means is that sometimes children, elderly, disabled, et cetera, are stuck at home. And this is a problem that first responders really haven't solved. When I've talked with them about it, they say, you know, then we tell the firefighters on scene that there's someone stuck at home at such and such an address. Well, again, if you do the math, there's not enough firefighters if you have a large community with people stuck at home. So this was one of the issues that we set about trying to tackle with our experiment. We worked with a community called the Comanche Trail Neighborhood Association. They were at the end of a long one-way in, one-way out road, and so were surrounded by park and preserve land. So they knew they were in danger. They had a close call with that nearby fire that I was just describing. The community wanted to organize themselves, but just hadn't been able to do it on their own. And they were willing to be part of an experiment with us at Travis County to see if a neighborhood fire drill would actually work and be useful. So we couldn't find any examples of this approach of neighborhood fire drills, so we decided to create one. And our goal was, and we told the neighbors this so they all knew that they were part of this experiment and that if it worked, we were going to share it widely. So we started with fire risk maps so that people understood the real threat at each of their homes. It brought the threat literally home to them, and it motivated people to participate. We also had the benefit of having a smart tech savvy resident who developed an app that was sort of an alerting system that would tell nearby neighbors, hey, you know, my pet's at home, my child's at home, my elderly parent is at home, can you help get them out if I can't get back in? But in reality, anyone could do this by just creating a group text on your phone of your trusted neighbors who you could call on in a time of need. It's just it's anticipating it and being prepared and setting it up in advance. The residents broke their community down into blocks, and they had block leaders who organized street by street and got everybody educated about the threat and the details of participating in the fire drill. We ran it a year ago, March of 2019, and it was quite a success. In fact, we won an award from the National Association of Counties, and we created an online link with instructions and resources. I don't know if you can make this link out, but we'll certainly make it available to ICLEI for anyone who wants to make use of it. But I think that one of the big lessons we learned was if you want to be rescued from climate disasters, you should prepare to be able to do it yourself. I'm happy to take any questions, but this was our on-the-ground experiment with trying to figure out how to improve resilience in a neighborhood in Travis County, and we've had a lot of interest from other neighborhoods in the area to make use of our resource to do it themselves and get themselves organized. So I'll wrap up there, and then whenever we have questions, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bridget. We'll take questions at the end when all our panelists have spoken. This is extremely interesting, and in a way, certainly having a crisis catalyzes then people to be interested in and on board, and also focusing on that redesign. This is a very, very interesting example. So thank you so much for sharing this. I'd love to hand over now to our next colleague, Eva, to share what is happening from Bratislava side.
So good evening, everyone, or yeah, maybe it's not evening in Austin. I am a project management manager that works at the office of the Chief City Architect at Bratislava City, which is the capital of the Slovak Republic. And we we have had some experience with resilience projects. Currently, we are engaged in the ARC project, which focuses on increasing resilience of cultural heritage and historical areas in cities, which might be threatened by climate change or other natural hazards. And today I will try to speak about the hazards that we face in terms of climate change in Bratislava and how it impacts our cultural heritage. And also I will talk about, I cannot move my slide. That's weird. Now it works. And then I will also talk about briefly what we noticed, what are the parallels between the COVID situation and climate change, and how we think that at least something we can learn from COVID and apply in terms of urban planning and reducing risks and enhancing resilience. So Bratislava, as I already explained, is the capital city of Slovak Republic. Slovakia is a 5 million country, has a population of 5 million and is located in Central Europe. Bratislava city covers an area of over 360 square kilometers. We have approximately the same area as Vienna, which is not very far away. It's 90 kilometers away from Bratislava. So Vienna and Bratislava are often related to as the twin cities. We have a population of almost 500,000 citizens, but during the day we get a surplus of around 200,000 commuters that come here for work or students coming here for their studies. We have become a covenant of mayors signatory and mayors adapt signatory. This was in the years 2012 and 2013. And since then, we've been also engaged in several EU-funded projects on climate change, such as the EU Cities Adapt or on Resin or currently the ARC project, which is a Horizon 2020 project. So as you can imagine, the city centers this is it's a normal case that a city center is very crowded, is usually one of the most I would say the part of the city where most of people are coming for work, where you have additional economic activity going on. There are many businesses, services. It's usually the, I would say, wealthiest part of the city, with high-rise buildings on its periphery, and this is also the case of Bratislava. And we have the old town is paved almost all the way. We have several historical gardens and parks in the city, but otherwise the city center is heavily paved, and we have many impermeable surfaces. We have river streams that have been channeled and put into pipes and run underneath the old town. And when we have extreme precipitation, the current pipeline system or the sewage network cannot take up all the rain, and then we have problems with our historical buildings becoming wet, and with our infrastructure simply sometimes breaking down, especially the sewage system in the center. And then we have rainwater basically threatening all the in situ preserved cultural heritage, such as for example, on the map on the right, you can see the black points. These are all sites that are 2,000 years old, because we used to have a Celtic oppidum in the historical centers and in the historical center, and still many remains of Celtic craft workshops have prevailed until today, and are on exposition in situ. We have been able to do almost a complete risk-based vulnerability assessment of climate change impacts in the resin project, but it's only an evaluation of the current state. It doesn't relate to any future scenarios of climate change development and what impacts it will bring, and how we should what can we do in terms of increasing resilience. So this is something that awaits us. These are pictures that you can see. For example, on the top left, you can see how a Celtic kiln, which was used for burning pottery, looked a few years ago, and on the right you can see that it looks a bit more white on the walls, and this is fungi that is creating due to water coming into the building from almost from all sides when there is too much rain. And the problem is that with cultural heritage preservation, you cannot just easily retrofit the building. It has to have look as originally as possible, and this is sometimes a battle we have with the monument preservationists. On the other hand, we have also outside cultural heritage that needs to be protected against rain, such as, for example, the Devin Castle, which is a national cultural monument, and it's very important to whole Slovakia, I would say. So it's of national relevance. And there we have also problems of pluvial flooding, but also rockfall from this wonderful cliff that you see on the bottom right. And there is a cycling path and a promenade underneath the castle. And some parts of it need to be occasionally closed when the rockfall risk increases. We have monitoring devices installed there that monitor the state, but still we need to be very careful. So I think Steve summed it very well up, what cities need to do in order to be able to withstand the risks and become resilient. And I think that with cities we focus pretty much, or in Bratislava, we are pretty much focused on the sustainable development goals, but I think this needs to become more emphasized among the other sustainable development goals. And Bratislava has recognized this need also. And in our next policy paper, let's call it paper, but it will be a strategy. Yeah, maybe that's a better name for it, is the action plan for adaptation for 2020 up to 2030. We would like to have disaster risk management as one of the key goals, and with concrete activities and indicators to help us create a more resilient Bratislava. We are also talking with our stakeholders about developing early warning systems. And what we very much need in Bratislava is also a communication strategy, how to communicate quickly and clearly with our citizens, how to communicate with them the risks, what they can do in order to save their property. So that is something that we need to work on more. In the ARC project, we've used the United Nations disaster resilience scorecard, which you can see here on the spider web graph, and there are 10 sectors or 10 essentials which a city needs to score itself according to. And as you can see, we received quite less than average score or average score in most of the the sectors, but still there is, on the other hand, there is a lot of room for improvement, I would say. In general, when we were filling out this questionnaire that had more than 100 questions, we realized how little information there is available for cities, and how our civil protection engineers in the city focus mostly on risks such as a terror attack or an explosion in the nearby oil refinery, for example, and things like this. But very little attention is paid to disasters or risks coming from climate change, such as heat waves or pluvial flooding. So what have you learned from COVID, and what we think the cities could do in order to become more resilient? We think that similarly to COVID, I think cities can build back better if they become a bit more self-reliant and self-sufficient, and to invest more in their capacity and tools for disaster risk management. We think that also cultural heritage and local traditions and local culture plays a very important role in this, for cities to build on their uniqueness when they are trying to build back from an economic crisis, which is also something that I think not just Bratislava but also many cities are fighting with after the COVID crisis, when they lost a lot of money because of cultural events being cancelled or sport events being cancelled. So this is a point I think that can help us building more or supporting more our local culture. Since people, you know, are now working more from home office, I think this even more underlines the need of building cities of short distances, which is also something that helps reduce carbon emissions. And also it's more attractive for living in general for people in urban districts. And also in terms of energy, we think that especially it's a case of Slovakia that we need the liberalization of the energy market. But for us, it would be very good if we were able to invest more in carbon neutral neighborhoods that can produce their own energy from renewable resources and be able to share a surplus of energy if it's created, share it with other users, with other entities in this neighborhood. But this is also a legislative barrier that we need to first overcome on national level in Slovakia. So this is everything from me, and if you have any questions, I will be happy to provide you with answers later on.
Thank you so much, Eva. It's very interesting to hear, especially the cultural heritage is such an important piece of your economic income generation as well, that it's critical to protect that, certainly. Thank you so much for sharing that. Very, very interesting and completely different case as compared to what we had from Texas. Taryn, I'd like to invite you to quickly join us on the panel and also briefly share just some ideas and information that you have from the African experience, since we unfortunately don't have the mayor of Kampala with us. So could you give us a bit of a snapshot of what is happening in Kampala and or African cities in general in this space? It surely is a hot topic also for the African continent.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marika, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Marika said, I'm from the African Secretariat, so we're based in Cape Town in South Africa, and we're also host to the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre. Unfortunately, the mayor of Kampala, as Marika said, was not able to be here, but I've been working with cities in Uganda for the past 10 years now, and we've got so many insightful lessons that we can share that we'd just like to pick out one or two. So I'd like to start by sharing some lessons from our UNA project. So UNA stands for Urban Natural Assets, and it started with funding from SweetBio in 2014. And obviously, you know, we're talking about natural assets, wetlands, rivers, coastal systems. But at the very core of this project, the idea is to actually mainstream nature into planning processes. And this is really important in the African context, given the rate of growth we have, the high levels of informality. We see, you know, development taking place without risk-sensitive urban planning, which increases vulnerability to climate change and to hazards. And in the African context, and I think in many other countries in the global south, we've got planners who have no control over growth and development. We've got land that's being planned that has no existing development. So we've got many, many challenges in the planning arena itself. So in 2017, we started working with both Kampala and Entebbe in Uganda. And in Kampala, we had many dialogues with the city. And I think this comes back to, Marika, what you said at the start, and it's about process. So it was demand driven and it was tailor made, and we spoke to the city and said, you know, this is the concept, this is the idea of the project, but what are our entry points? And it was decided to actually look at mapping Kampala's urban natural assets. So what assets are there, where are they, what condition are they in? And then going back to what Steve mentioned earlier, developing a hotspot map of those natural assets so that we can actually try and mainstream that into planning. And this is, again, where the process of how we engage with cities and how we implement our projects, our trainings, our meetings is so critical. And we often see that process is underrepresented when we showcase the project outcomes. We have a report or we have a nice meeting, but we don't always pull apart and share the lessons from how the processes happen and where those light bulb moments actually take place. So if we're thinking about Kampala, at the same time that we were developing the UNA maps as part of the UNA project, Kampala was actually developing a disaster risk reduction action plan with support from DRR as part of the Making My Cities Resilient campaign. And one of the key processes we adopt in UNA and was adopted by Kampala and the DRR action plan development was actually to create these safe, reflective, open spaces where co-production can take place. So there were robust dialogues with multi-sectors present, multidisciplines. Kampala reached out to utilities, to universities, civil societies, NGOs, the private sector, national government was brought on board. And this was really critical to get buy-in not only to the policy and the plans as they move forward, but also to really foster that mainstreaming. And through this validation process and these participatory engagements, both within the UNA mapping, but also within the DRR action plans, the stakeholders really got to take ownership of the process. And what we found was so many synergies between so they used the DRR Making My Cities Resilience campaign essentials. And number 5 is actually looking at natural safeguards and buffers and ecosystems. And the recommendations that came out of the UNA mapping process were actually then able to be mainstreamed into the disaster risk reduction action plan. So it's not 2 projects or 2 recommendations or 2 plans that are taking separate pathways, actually coming together because of these robust participatory planning processes. I'd just like to share a quote from one of my colleagues in Kampala who spoke in a webinar for DRR a couple of weeks ago. And he said that we need to build capacity in our cities on nature-based solutions and to build citizen-led interventions as we then stand a better chance of expanding our green infrastructure in cities if we have our citizens supporting our actions. And I think really that's the basis of it. It's what these processes are and sharing the learnings and the outcomes that come with these processes between our cities and between our networks. I'd just like to take a few minutes to also note Kampala's been working on the Green City Infrastructure Ordinance, and the idea is to really improve and set up guidelines to how they plan and manage their green spaces to harness benefits for the community and for the city as a whole. So they're doing a lot in the resilient space. And what is great about some of the aspects more recently is Kampala developed an urban drainage master plan, they also developed the Disaster Risk Reduction Action Plan, which the urban natural asset mapping was mainstreamed into. And they also had a climate adaptation plan. And we see this often, there's so many different plans. And what is actually taking place now is really amazing, because harnessing those participatory processes, they're now formulating those 3 plans into a resilience and a sustainability plan for Kampala Capital City Authority. So again, it's finding those ways of integrating and mainstreaming and not having separate sectors working in isolation, but bringing them together as a strategy for the whole city. I know we're very short on time, so I'd just like to mention, while I have the floor, that a lot of these processes that we've mentioned can actually be found in a series of 11 handbooks that have been developed as part of ICLEI's UNA project, and they're available on the city's Biodiversity Centre website. And there's a lot of information about how to work with informality, how to create spaces for reflective engagement, how to create space for on-the-ground implementation that really brings citizens and all sectors and stakeholders together. So I think that's one that the participants might be interested in following up on. There's also some great tools, which unfortunately I don't have time to go into, but some great tools on alternative planning approaches, which have been tested and applied in African cities, in Mozambique, in Kenya, and in Uganda. One particular approach called urban tinkering. So you can also find that on the city's Biodiversity Centre, which ICLEI hosts. You can also find some great tools. Steve mentioned earlier Cities with Nature. So there's some great tools and mechanisms that you can find there, and some great work being undertaken related to ICLEI's Fortitude Initiative, which was launched in 2017. So there's lots of tools from process to implementation, and a lot of lessons that have been deconstructed to be able to better share with cities within the network, as we're all working towards sustainability and building resilience at the local level. I'd just like to thank you for your time, and just to say that we're increasingly trying to think outside the box on how we can identify nature-based solutions and pathways to reduce urban vulnerability to hazards and to climate change, and how we can use these more effectively moving forward. And there are so many great innovations happening in Africa, and we'd be more than happy to share them with you. So please do get in touch if you'd like any more information about what we're doing in Africa. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Taryn, also for jumping in. Much appreciated. And indeed, there's a host of materials out there, guidance and tools, which we will also try and pull together and make available in general on the ICLEI website. Bridget, lovely to see you with us. Eva, would you like to join us as well? We've got a question for you specifically. So we'll run a little bit over, colleagues, so if you bear with us, and we'll still take some questions, so please type up questions if you wish in the chat box. So a question from Michael. Eva, this one is for you. Does Bratislava have a coordinating group that ties the traditional urban planning function to the sustainability and climate adaptation functions? Very interesting question.
Well, according to my knowledge, we have a working group on clean air. We have a working group on greenery. Unfortunately, we do not yet have a working group on climate adaptation. Luckily, we have the EU-funded projects, which for which we need to always create a working group. So we have a group of stakeholders that we cooperate with, where also people from different departments are invited if there are any meetings. So currently, the working groups for the EU-funded projects have been somehow supplementing, and officially there isn't a working group on climate change adaptation. However, currently, for example, we have another working group that focuses on the new master plan and updates to the current master plan, where there is some kind of a working group that deals with urban planning in terms of climate change adaptation. But this is done only for the purpose of the new master plan or for the updates of the new master plan. So I think this is, we currently don't have even a climate change adaptation department. So I think this is something that that definitely should be dealt with in Bratislava. And I think it should be a resilience department, not just climate change adaptation department, definitely. So, but we will see.
Thank you. So let's we can definitely write to the mayor as well and really encourage. Typically, from the experience that we've had in ICLA, is also setting up a climate team that deals with mitigation, adaptation, and resilience together to break through these silos, because the silos is part of the problem. And I think if we listen to what Bridget was sharing, also the urban planning piece, the people in place is what we're talking about, and having the necessity to really understand the current risks, vulnerabilities, and threats, but also these unexpected ones, the COVID-19s of the future. We don't know what is going to happen, and having teams that are sort of in place, I think, is really critical. Bridget, I'd like to come back to your presentation, which is really, really interesting, and considering the massive threat that you've faced and you've literally had to deal with. And the local solutions that you've applied, did you also address, did you need to change policies, or were you able to just move with your local stakeholders and design what you needed to do, or were there very particular steps you needed to follow?
That's actually a great question. We we have a I would say a fairly robust kind of first responder ecosystem already in place, and so I just tapped that and asked all of those different entities to work with us on the plan. We spent about a year meeting with the neighbors and literally kind of creating this from scratch. So we didn't really have to change policies, but we are having to spend some time looking at how we scale it up. This was very time intensive because it was an experiment. And so we told everyone this is not going to be the norm. We're literally trying to test this out and see if this would work. So we've written up instructions and sort of condensed the lessons that we've learned, but also a big message is for any community that wants to do a fire drill, they have to organize themselves. They can't come to our firefighters or our police or our first responders and say, will you do all this for us? The necessity truly is for the community to organize itself, and you have to get, I think we put a 50% participation requirement in it, or it's less useful. If only a small fraction of the community participates, it's not a good use of everyone's time. So, so the how-to instructions require a fair bit of work on the front end by the community, and you know that ebbs and flows depending on people's awareness of the threat. You know, watching all the wildfires in California has been terrifying for a lot of us here. And so I think there's a heightened awareness of that. But the fact that this community had been threatened by that wildfire where that entire community of 10,000 people had to evacuate on one road in and out made the people in Comanche Trail much more aware of their danger. And then I think when we used the fire threat map, which literally maps out where a fire is likely to burn, given certain assumptions about wind direction, et cetera, that brought it home as well. People could see where their home was on the map and see if they were in the, you know, bright red danger zone. That was news to them in terms of, this is where I live, this is the threat to my home. So, you know, unfortunately, it seems to require disasters before people start to pay attention, I guess, which is a human failing.
Yep.
But it was a big takeaway, I think, for all of us that there's a burden on the resident and on the communities to be prepared, because all of the people who are the professionals, they know what to do within their group of other professionals, but they don't have the time or the training or the mental orientation to go out and organize residents. They were a little uncomfortable about it. It took us a while to bring them along to let the residents run this fire drill and experience it themselves. They actually at one point said, we're worried that people will crash into each other during the fire drill. So what we'd like to propose instead is that people just back out of their driveways and then drive back into their driveways. And I had to argue with them and say, that's pointless, and you'll have a lot of angry residents on your hands if you don't do the fire drill as we have been planning and describing. But it's part of the problem with how we approach these things. The experts know best. You other people get out of the way is kind of the attitude, and that won't work.
Okay. No, absolutely not. I think this taking responsibility for your family, for your place, I think is really an important point you made very well. I think so. I've heard so many interesting things. I think from Steve in terms of the process, in terms of the tools, considering cascading impacts. I think that's such a critical piece. And maybe Steve, if you could take the last word, maybe. What do you see is the most critical thing local and regional governments need to do in this space now? What is their first immediate priority in your view?
I'm not sure about the first immediate priority, but what I omitted to say, and I've been thinking this listening to all of the other presenters, is that when one of these events hits, we just scramble to respond. But we have to apply the principle of risk reduction, which is really clear in the UN DRR, disaster risk reduction. It's what we can do during the quiet times to build the systems to be far more resilient. It's not about developing our emergency management plans, which is where everyone's mobilised and we go flat out and then we try to build back. It's how we use all of our systems, all of our planning and all of the services and functions that cities apply to make sure that we are in the best possible position when the next bushfire, earthquake, pandemic, or civil disturbance hits. So I think we've just got to review all of our programs and all of our operations and keep on applying the principles of resilience to them. And that's a big job.
Yep, that's certainly a big job, needing lots of capacity. So maybe a message to national governments: we need more capacity at the subnational level. A message maybe to all local and regional governments: take this seriously and do something. Look into your risks and vulnerabilities and your planning, and the lessons learned that we're collecting in this current space as ICLEI, but also all our partners are collecting very interesting lessons learned on how to deal with different things, looking at it from the nature-based solutions perspective, looking at hard infrastructure and many other spaces. So there's a lot to be done, but there's also a lot of guidance out there. So we really recommend that you encourage and mobilize your colleagues to engage in the space. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a hot topic. It's an important topic. We need to build back better is the new term everybody's using now during COVID-19, but it's also about the redesign of our cities, our urban spaces, and protecting people and the environment. Real leadership is what's needed now, and we've heard some really interesting examples. So thank you so much, colleagues, for sharing your different experiences and perspectives. It's been really very interesting. I'd like to wrap up by thanking our donors for Daring Cities. We've got the German government actively supporting us, the BMU and BMZ, for which we are very grateful. We've also got the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, and we've got the bank, the foundation of the savings bank in Bonn. So without that support, we also would not have been able to do this great session. There are many more sessions also, ladies and gentlemen, so take a look at the program. A lot still also on resilience, climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and we'll have some interesting launches in the coming weeks. So please join us and share and stay safe in these strange times.
Thank you, you all as well. Yeah, you all stay safe too.
Thank you. Stay healthy.
Bye-bye.